Hello. So, to continue our series on box design for board games and card games, I asked folks on Twitter and on Patreon to send me their questions. What are you wondering about for boxes? We got some questions? I got some answers. Maybe. Hopefully. So, let's answer some questions about box design. Jeremy Morgan asks, what are the main factors that go into the size of the box? Numbers and types of components, whether it'll fit on a card, etc. Every publisher is going to have their own reasons for making the boxes on their games, whatever they are. Generally speaking, a manufacturer has some standard box sizes that is most efficient for them to produce and manufacture for the publisher. If a publisher tries to deviate from that, it's going to bump up the cost per unit pretty significantly and start hitting the economies of scale that are really tenuous at best for a lot of smaller and mid-sized publishers. Sometimes a box is a little bit bigger than normal because they expect to have expansions, which is a good thing. I would hope, because that suggests confidence in the game line. One thing that I don't think gets enough attention is that current markets justify certain prices when the boxes are a certain size. So some games that come in like small blister packs, those little micro games, those rarely go higher than $20 at most. Usually they're going to be around the $10 range because those are supposed to be like impulse buys, things that you just kind of add on either to an Amazon order or you just kind of see it on the side while you're shopping at your local game store. The difference in cost and between two games in terms of its production costs may not be that different from each other, but if you can get that game into a larger box and command a slightly higher markup, then the economies of scale that you're working with and the prices that you're able to command for that game that's in a slightly bigger box are totally worth it and can help keep a publisher afloat to keep on producing the games that you do like. So I know and I understand why there are some complaints about boxes of air, so to speak, but there are some real significant reasons and legitimate reasons for publishers to continue to keep on producing boxes of that size. Oh, and as far as stores go, sometimes smaller boxes and smaller packages are a little bit easier to shoplift. So you want a package that can stand up on its own, have good shelf presence, and also make it harder to shoplift. Stephen Dewey asks if I have an opinion regarding tin containers versus cardboard boxes. Me personally, I don't mind tin boxes. The biggest hazard with them on the manufacturing and publishing side is that they tend to get pretty dinged up and damaged. They're less pliable than cardboard, so if they take a hit, oftentimes that hit stays on that tin box and you end up having to replace a lot of units just because they're damaged and having to sell them at a loss usually. So on the manufacturing side, I just tend to prefer cardboard boxes. As a consumer, I have no opinion one way or another. I suppose tin boxes can sometimes be a little bit difficult to stack on a shelf, but I'm less concerned about that stuff. Stephen Dewey also asks if I have a checklist of information to make sure everything's on the game box. I do go into that a little bit on this episode here. I'll link to it on one of these corners. Yeah. Terry Tibke asks, I'm curious about multi-compartmental boxes or ones that hold various decks of cards in slots. I realize the exteriors are no different, but if you have any knowledge or tips around this, I'd love to hear them. Well, it's a little bit outside my field of expertise. I haven't really produced anything quite like that in my career, but I know the basics of it. It's usually, if it's going to be a really fancy thing, it's going to be a vacuum molded plastic insert. Otherwise, you can kind of make do with some cardboard folded options with some supplemental foam to kind of give it a little bit more structure. In either case, the reason you don't see it all that often is because in either of those cases, it adds expense per unit to every box and doesn't increase the perceived value of the game for the average consumer. At least that's for the vast majority of the game buying public, who are usually buying these games as gifts, to be honest. Now, the hobby game market certainly loves those kinds of functional details, good inserts, that kind of thing. We kind of fetishize a lot of that stuff, and you'll see that a lot on Board Game Geek, where people admire the fidelity of a certain insert to kind of keep everything level and flat so it doesn't shake up when you put it up on your shelf. But I gotta tell you, that's an unusual concern among most game buyers. So that tends to be why you don't see it that often. In high-end stuff with hobby market that is very active and very vocal, you'll see it more often in those cases. So that's why you see it in things like deck builders and some other really highly produced abstract games, even things with minis, stuff like that. Dylan Green asks, how do you actually print or make a box as a prototype for your personal use? Now, me personally, I don't often make a box for my own personal use or anything like that. It tends to be a lot of work, and oftentimes the game is going to change over the course of multiple playtests enough that it kind of makes it not really worth the effort, to be quite honest. So I have a lot of generic boxes and containers that I reuse over and over again for different prototypes. Now that's a different story if I'm going to be submitting a prototype to a publisher and leaving it with them. In those cases, I want to at least give a clean package that has, for example, a full-size sticker sheet that has the game's logo and my personal contact information, so that they have it all in one big container. Nat Levan asks, better to have art that wraps down the sides from the top or completely separate side panels? If you take an illustration and you wrap it around the corners, you better make sure that the composition of that illustration is going to be ready to accommodate that. You don't want any critical faces or things like that to kind of go over the corner, because then they're just going to kind of get cut off. It's usually going to be a custom illustration that you're requesting, or you can take apart layers of that illustration and move them around and adjust them so that they fit that composition well. Usually you're not going to be able to have that much control if you're kind of working with a team. It's just generally easier to make some kind of framing device, put some art or texture or something around the corners, so that you have plenty of space to move things around within that frame, and also to make sure that if things are slightly miscut or misregistered, it isn't as a big of a problem. Zach Hoekstra asks, what part of the box should the most critical information go on, front, side, or back? The game title, the game designer, and the publisher are pretty critical for the front, in that order: game title, game designer, publisher. Now for the sides, that is where you really do want to have all the player count and time and all that stuff in there as well. It's maybe less important to have some other information. If you have art, then that's a nice place to have it, but make sure that it doesn't conflict and interfere with the game title and all that other stuff. Now on the back, it's a whole other thing. You have a whole lot of information, a whole lot of real estate you can use for the back of the box. The back of the box, I really de-emphasize the game title. I still put it there a lot of times, but more often than not, the biggest and most important thing on the back of the box is a full display of some components or some art that conveys the theme of the game, with a text blurb that explains the basic idea of it. And then usually in the lower part, there's a lot of required information, and I go into some of that in a previous episode as well. So it's harder to prioritize one thing over another on the back, but each side has its own priority list, I should say. Nick Ferris asks, what at minimum do you think needs to go into the spine of the box? And does this change with box size? Game title is going to be important for you, just so that if it's stored on its side on a game store shelf, you can still tell what the game is. Maybe designer is less important, but it can be small anyway. But the player count, time, information, that is important, and a publisher is generally going to want their brand, their mark on their spine somewhere too. If you can get all of that information in there and then still also throw in some cool art to get a bit of theme in there, all the better, but really those are the most important things. Matthew Gravelin asks if I have any recommendations on inserts versus baggies versus some other option. Me personally, I think kind of like half-assing it is worse than no-assing it. Either provide baggies or go the whole 9 yards and have like a vacuum molded plastic insert. Cardboard has got an iffy reputation. Sometimes it doesn't work as well as you hope, unfortunately. And as for leaving room for expansions, by all means, go for it. If you think that your game is actually going to survive long enough to have like one expansion, that's huge. Most games will go through one print run. And that's optimistic. Sometimes games only sell through maybe half or even less than their first print run, and the remainder of that inventory gets sold off at cost or less than cost. If you leave room in your box for expansions and you have a plan in place for those expansions to continue to come later on, sure, go for it. Yeah. Jonathan Ying asks if I have any preferences on sleeved or unsleeved cards fitting into inserts. Now, if you're going to go through the trouble of making a vacuum molded insert, then yeah, I think you're targeting your hobby market already. So really make room for those sleeves if you possibly can. Rodney Thompson asks about box manufacturing and where I manufacture for many different clients. Just to be clear, I don't personally manufacture boxes. I just design them, and I usually work within a template that a manufacturer has provided to me. That manufacturer usually is based in China. Sometimes they're within the United States, but that's pretty rare. Usually they're in China or in Germany, and they will work with me and work with the publisher to send me a template that fits a box model that they have in stock. And I can design around that template within the bleeds and all those other specs that they have provided. Yeah, it works. Hello, thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. If you want to download more stuff and more content, you can find it over in the Patreon at the link below. Thanks very much. Bye.